Introduction. The question of whether Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens were three separate species, or simply different expressions of the same one, is among the most fascinating debates in evolutionary science. The traditional view says three species, largely isolated, with only occasional interbreeding that rarely produced viable offspring. But what if that picture is wrong? What if there were actually three ecological races of a single human species? This hypothesis isn't just speculation. It resolves several puzzles that the classical model struggles with, and it's increasingly supported by genetic and archaeological evidence. What exactly is an ecological race? In biology, the term race simply means a population of the same species that is adapted to its specific environment. The decisive criterion for whether two groups belong to the same species isn't how different they look. It's whether they can produce fertile, viable offspring. Think about dogs. A Siberian Husky and a Chihuahua look so different you might think they're separate species. Yet they're both the same species. They can mate and produce fertile offspring. The ecological races hypothesis applies this exact principle to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. What the genetics tell us. The strongest evidence comes from genetics. Studies confirm there was 7,000 years of continuous gene flow between Neanderthals and modern humans. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was regular contact over hundreds of generations. The children from these unions were fully integrated into communities. If Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had truly been different species, these hybrids either wouldn't have survived or wouldn't have been fertile. Today, nearly all people outside Africa carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. In parts of Southeast Asia and Oceania, Denisovan ancestry reaches up to 5%. These aren't random accidents. They're visible traces of a shared past. The demographic puzzle. Another argument for the race's hypothesis comes from demography. About 900,000 years ago, the common ancestor population of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens went through an extreme bottleneck. Only about 1,280 breeding individuals survived for roughly 117,000 years. The classical model has a problem with this number. Such a tiny population should have gone extinct through inbreeding, harmful mutations, or simply a single bad stroke of luck. And even if it survived, how could such a small, genetically uniform group produce the diversity we see in the fossil record? The answer, according to the race's hypothesis, the bottleneck wasn't the end. It was a genetic reset button. The survivors were genetically extremely similar, almost like one extended family. From this shared genetic foundation, natural selection shaped three different types, each perfectly adapted to its environment. This isn't contradictory. It's exactly what you'd expect from a single species expanding into different habitats. Three types for three worlds. Let's look at each group more closely. The Neanderthals were masters of the cold. Their robust build with short limbs conserved heat. Their large noses warmed frigid air. Perfect adaptations to glacial Europe, following the biological rules of Bergman and Allen. The Denisovans were specialists for extreme altitudes. They passed on the EPS1 gene to us, which allows modern Tibetans to live at over 4,000 meters elevation, where others would suffer from oxygen deprivation. And we, Homo sapiens, are the tropical specialists. Slender build, efficient sweating, less body air, everything needed to avoid overheating in the African heat. Three completely different body plans, all shaped from the same genetic material and all fully capable of interbreeding. The network that held it together. One objection remains. If the groups were so perfectly adapted to their environments, how could they stay in contact? The answer, they didn't need to travel constantly. A thin but steady network of contacts between neighboring groups sufficed. Marriage alliances, trade in valuable materials like obsidian or ochre, and exchange of knowledge at regular meeting places. These contacts were just enough to prevent dangers in breeding, but not so strong that they erased local adaptations. The groups remained genetically connected without losing their specializations. What this means for our understanding. The idea that Neanderthals and Denisovans were merely ecological races of one human species has far-reaching implications. First, they weren't primitive ancestors we eventually replaced. They were our contemporaries, our relatives, part of us. Their legacy lives on in our genes. Second, The differences we see among human populations today, skin color, body type, adaptations of climate and altitude, are simply continuations of the same principle. Humanity has always been diverse, and that diversity isn't a sign of division but of adaptability. Third, the key to our species' survival wasn't isolation. It was connection. The people after the bottleneck didn't survive because they shut themselves off from others. They survived because they built networks, shared knowledge, and formed families across group boundaries. A note of caution. Of course, this is a hypothesis, not established fact. Most researchers still classify Neanderthals and Denisovans as separate species, but the genetic evidence for continuous mixing and the demographic contradictions of the classical model are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The ecological races hypothesis doesn't claim to have the final answer. It offers a framework that explains more of the available evidence with fewer contradictions. And it reminds us that our shared human story is far more interconnected than we've been taught to believe. Conclusion: the old narrative of three separate species that barely interacted is giving way to a more nuanced picture. One highly adaptable species, shaped by different environments, yet bound together by thousands of years of continuous contact. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens weren't strangers. They were family, and that family connection, woven through tens of thousands of years, is still written in our genes today. The evidence is mounting. The contradictions are accumulating. And the simplest, most causally consistent explanation points in one direction. One species, three ecological races, one shared human story.